Lucky. Come and say hello. Yeah. Yeah, you're so cute. You're gonna be my assistant. I love you. You waving? You waving? So cute. You want to learn about Henry VIII? Yeah? You know who that is? You think he's a cat? You think I'm a cat? Yeah. Hello and welcome to Learn English with Monica. In today's video, I'm going to tell you about the history of one of England's most famous and notorious kings, King Henry VIII. Tudor history is certainly a big part of British culture and history. You may already be familiar with King Henry VIII. He was not a very nice man, to say the least, and is famous for having had 6 wives. So sit back and enjoy the story of King Henry VIII. Henry VIII was born on the 28th of June 1491 and died on the 28th of January 1547. He was King of England from 1509 until his death. He reigned for almost 38 years. Henry was born to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He had an elder brother, Arthur, and 2 sisters, Margaret and Mary. Arthur, Henry's brother, was heir to the throne, which meant that he would become king when their father, Henry VII, died. However, Arthur became ill and died when Henry was 11 years old. This meant that Henry was first in line to the throne. Henry's father was very protective of him, as he was now the only male heir. Whenever the prince wished to go out to hunt or joust, he had to be accompanied at all times. Jousting was a medieval sporting contest in which 2 opponents on horseback would fight one another with lances. A lance is a long weapon with a pointed steel head. In 1509, Henry VII died of tuberculosis, and Henry became king at the age of 17. That's a pretty big responsibility for someone so young. In the same year, Henry married Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, who had been briefly married to Henry's deceased brother Arthur in 1501. Catherine was 23 when she married Henry and was over 5 years older than him. Henry desperately wanted a son to ensure the future of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine got pregnant early on in the marriage, but sadly suffered a miscarriage, meaning that she lost the baby. She then gave birth to a son, Henry, in 1511, but unfortunately the couple's joy was brief, as the baby prince died a few weeks later. In 1516, Catherine gave birth to Princess Mary, later Queen Mary I, but sadly, all of her other 5 pregnancies ended in miscarriage and stillbirth. Henry did have an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, after an affair with one of Catherine's maids. However, this son could not become king because he was illegitimate. Illegitimate means that something is not legal by law, and in the past referred to a child who was born to parents who were not married. This child could not have the same rights or treatment as children born within marriage. As time passed, hopes of an heir began to fade. Catherine had turned 40 and she wasn't getting any younger. Henry began to worry that his marriage might be cursed, as he had angered God by marrying his brother's widow. In 1526, Henry VIII fell in love with a younger woman named Anne Boleyn. However, Henry would need to divorce Catherine before he could have Anne. It took Henry 7 years to get a divorce from Catherine. So all-consuming was Henry's desire for a divorce that it became known as the King's Great Matter. Catherine refused to give Henry a divorce, and without her consent, Henry needed the Pope to grant him a divorce. Henry asked the Pope, but the Pope would not do this. The Pope said that it went against the teachings of the Catholic Church. Henry blamed Thomas Wolsey, who was an important advisor to Henry. Wolsey was a cardinal, which is an important figure in the Church. Henry blamed Wolsey for failing to change the Pope's mind. He sacked him and had him put on trial, though Wolsey died before this could happen. After that, Thomas More became Henry's main advisor. But More opposed the divorce, so he was replaced a few years later by Thomas Cromwell. Henry also chose a man called Thomas Cranmer to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry knew that Cranmer would do what he wanted, and Cranmer agreed that Henry could have a divorce from Catherine. Henry asked Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, which meant that the King, and not the Pope, was head of the Church in England. This created the new Church of England. The Pope was so angry that he excommunicated Henry, meaning that Henry was thrown out of the Catholic Church. Henry insisted all acknowledge him, rather than the Pope, as God's representative on earth. Those who refused were put to death, including his Chancellor, Thomas More, who was executed at the Tower of London in 1535. Henry pretty much executed anybody who didn't agree with him, angered him, or made a mistake. I can imagine it must have felt like walking on eggshells if you had the misfortune to be associated with King Henry VIII. Do you remember this idiom, walking on eggshells? It means to be extremely cautious around somebody in order not to upset or offend them. Henry married Anne Boleyn in 1533. Not only was Catherine of Aragon heartbroken by the divorce, Henry also forbade her to see her daughter Mary. She died 3 years later. You would think that after divorcing the poor woman, Henry would at least let her have custody of their daughter. Between 1536 and 1540, in a campaign led by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, Henry seized land and treasures and destroyed or closed over 800 monasteries and other religious houses. He also seized the wealth of the Catholic Church and became the richest monarch in British history. In 1533, as building works for the new royal apartments at Hampton Court progressed, Anne Boleyn's first child, the future Queen Elizabeth I, was born. 3 years later, Henry was still without a male heir, and he started thinking how to get rid of Anne. Rumours spread by supporters of the old Catholic regime accused Anne of adultery and plotting the king's death. Despite her protestations of innocence, Henry ordered Anne to the Tower of London, where she was executed for treason in 1536. Henry married Jane Seymour only 10 days after Anne's death. Well, he certainly didn't waste any time in moving on. In 1537, the future Edward VI was born. Tragically, Jane died not long after the birth. Henry was heartbroken about Jane's death, and she was known to be his favourite wife. I think the fact that she gave him a son was a big part of it. Henry's obsession with having a son was very ironic, as his son Edward became king at the age of 9 and died 6 years later at the age of 15. It was Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, who became the great Elizabeth I and was regarded as one of England's greatest monarchs. Her long reign was one of the most brilliant in English history. It is remembered for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and for voyages of exploration and discovery. She reigned for 45 years. Anyway, back to the story. In the meantime, Henry's religious policies met with opposition in the wider country. In 1536, he mercilessly executed the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a social protest against the king's religious revolution. Discriminatory laws were also passed against witchcraft and homosexuality, which had terrible consequences for many innocent people persecuted over the next 200 years. Henry had become a tyrant. A tyrant is a cruel, oppressive, and unjust leader. Despite being a horrible man, Henry was actually extremely intelligent and talented. He was a linguist, sports mad, fashion conscious, a fine musician and songwriter, and culturally sophisticated. Henry VIII enjoyed being outdoors and getting exercise. He loved hunting, jousting, wrestling, tennis, dancing, and reading. One of Henry VIII's hobbies was falconry, which is a kind of hunting, using trained birds of prey called hawks. Wow, the guy certainly had a lot of hobbies. Despite the birth of Prince Edward, Henry VIII knew that the future of the Tudor dynasty remained fragile. He needed spare heirs, and in 1540, his chief minister Thomas Cromwell persuaded him to marry German princess Anne of Cleves. When Anne arrived, Henry did not think she was as pretty as she looked in the pictures he had seen of her, and he was not satisfied with her. Anne was also unhappy and agreed for the marriage to be annulled after only 6 months. An annulment is similar to a divorce and is a legal contract that declares that a marriage was invalid or void. A marriage is considered void when it is not consummated. In other words, meaning that the couple never had sexual relations. This was the case in Anne and Henry's marriage. At least Anne was lucky that annulment was as far as Henry wanted to take things, and she was spared execution. On top of that, Henry also granted her a generous settlement, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, where she lived for the rest of her life. Maybe Henry was in a good mood when he made those decisions. Cromwell got the blame instead, and was executed for his poor matchmaking skills. Henry then married one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, the teenaged Catherine Howard. Henry and Catherine got married in 1540. Henry showered Catherine with presents and enjoyed having a much younger wife. However, Catherine soon got tired of Henry and started to flirt with other men. To be honest, I don't blame her. Thomas Cranmer presented the king with evidence of Catherine's infidelity. Catherine Howard was arrested at Hampton Court and later taken to the Tower of London, where she was executed in 1542. Legend has it that the ghost of a terrified Catherine Howard haunts the state apartments at Hampton Court. Apparently, Catherine's ghost runs to the chapel to plead for mercy with Henry VIII. I certainly wouldn't want to spend the night at Hampton Court Palace. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was in bad health. After a bad injury in 1536, when he had fallen from his horse at a joust, he developed a recurring leg ulcer, which restricted him physically. Some historians suggest that this accident, after he was unconscious for over 2 hours, had long-lasting psychological effects on the king. They point to evidence of a change in his personality after 1536 and his increasingly tyrannical behaviour. Personally, I think that Henry was just a horrible person anyway and had a few loose screws long before the accident. To have a few loose screws is an idiom, meaning that somebody is crazy and unstable. Henry remained in constant pain from his leg ulcer and began to put on a lot of weight. By the time he was 50, his waist size expanded to a whopping 137 centimetres or 53.9 inches. His weight ballooned to the stage where he needed a form of wheelchair to get about. Henry married his last wife, twice widowed Catherine Parr, at Hampton Court in 1543. Apart from being the only wife to survive Henry, perhaps Catherine's greatest achievement was to be the first Queen of England to write and publish her own books. You go, girl! Henry VIII died at the age of 55 on January 28, 1547. Historians still speculate on the nature of his final illness, but his obesity no doubt contributed to his decline in health. Whether you like him or loathe him, in many ways, Henry VIII created modern Britain. His father, Henry VII, had united the warring houses of Lancaster and York and brought financial stability, but this wasn't enough. England needed a strong ruler in the early 1500s, someone who would prevent the country from slipping back into the endless civil wars of the past and establish a modern and efficient nation-state. Henry VIII was such a king. Henry VIII had over 60 homes, but Hampton Court was his favourite palace. Once he had taken it from Cardinal Wolsey, the king transformed it to demonstrate his power and magnificence. Hampton Court was Henry VIII's pleasure palace, which he turned into a fabulous centre of entertaining, with feasting, jousting, and hunting. People of high social standing were expected to attend court and participate as courtiers. Maintaining a position at court was an expensive business, but the rewards were high if you remained among Henry VIII's favourites. However, being a Tudor courtier was not always easy, particularly under Henry VIII, who was known for his bad temper, and as you know, for going as far as having you executed. I really recommend visiting Hampton Court Palace. It's a really spectacular place, and you can learn more about Henry VIII and more about history of life at the palace. That's all for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Let me know in the comments which facts about Henry VIII you found the most interesting. I'll see you next time.